Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm super excited to be getting into this next little mini series for you, which is all about compression. Everything that you need to know about compression. Let's get straight into it. So compression. Compression is arguably one of the most challenging subject matters in music production to understand. It's the least well explained, in my opinion, and it's made the most confusing, when in reality, like all processes in music production, it's made up of a series of quite simple steps. And once you understand the steps and what each function in a compressor does, the whole thing becomes much more straightforward. It's demystified really quickly. However, before we start understanding the anatomy of a compressor and what all of the different functions do, we need to first understand what the role of compression is. Why do we need to compress anything? Compression, as the name suggests, is the process of squashing something. It's making something smaller. What is it that we're squashing in compression? We are squashing the dynamic range of a signal. So I want you to imagine a waveform like this one. You can see within this waveform that there are higher peaks and lower peaks. There is dynamic range. There are some sections where it's louder and some sections where it's quieter. Now, a compressor's job is to reduce the difference between the loudest parts and the quietest parts to make the dynamic range more consistent. Okay, that's all well and good. We understand what compression is. It's reducing the dynamic range of something. But why would we want to do that? Well, the benefit of compression comes when we are in the process of mixing something. Imagine this. You have a number of different parts in your arrangement. Let's say you have a drum part and a bass part and a guitar part and a lead vocal part, for sake of argument. Each one of those parts will have a dynamic range. It will have louder parts and quieter parts. So let's imagine that you balance all of those parts according to the chorus in your song, the loudest part of the song, hypothetically, the chorus. You get the chorus sounding great with all those parts nicely balanced. They're all playing quite strong parts. They're all kind of going for it. It sounds good. But then you come out of the chorus and you go into a different section, and all of a sudden, the dynamic range of each of those parts is different and the balance sounds totally off. Well, that is because each instrumental part will have dynamic range. One way that you can make those transitions between different dynamic sections more consistent or easier is to reduce the dynamic range of parts. By reducing the dynamic range of parts, you make the overall signal level more consistent, and therefore parts become easier to balance in a mix, because you're not going to have a part that all of a sudden jumps out because it's got a really loud part, and on the flip side, a part that disappears completely because it goes really quiet all of a sudden. You're going to have much more consistent signal levels. That is the benefit of compression. To say that one more time, the benefit of compression is that by reducing the dynamic range of parts, you are able to balance things more easily in a mix, because you don't have parts that are jumping out so high and parts that are disappearing because they're much quieter. That, in a nutshell, is compression. So let's jump into our DAW and let's look at a compressor. So here is the stock compressor from Logic Pro. There are, in effect, 6 functions that make up the process of compression. 6. By understanding these 6 functions, we understand compression. Now, there are lots of different sorts of compressors, and we will address those in subsequent videos. But first, before we start thinking about different types of compressor, we need to understand the basic functions of compression, and we're going to do that by looking at a stock digital compressor. Every DAW, whether it's Logic Pro or Ableton or Pro Tools or anything else, will have a stock digital compressor. Digital means that it's transparent, okay? It's not going to add any additional color or saturation or flavor to the sound. And that's how we first need to learn compression. So let's start by looking at the first control on our compressor. The first control is the threshold. Okay, now it's very difficult to say whether one function is more or less important than any other function because the different controls on a compressor work together. But probably if you were going to state which function is the most important, the threshold and the ratio combined are the most important functions on a compressor. The threshold is the point at which the compressor starts working. Let's say that again. The threshold is the point at which a compressor starts working. What does that mean? Well, let's take this drum pattern as an example. I'm going to solo out this drum pattern and let's look on our meter here at where this drum pattern is peaking. So it's peaking at -5 dB, okay? Now this compressor currently is set to 0 dB. That's the level at which the compressor is going to start working. So if I turn this compressor on, it's not going to do anything because the level of the signal coming into the compressor is less than where the threshold is set. So it's not going to do any work. Let's illustrate. Let's turn the compressor on. No movement on the needle whatsoever. Okay, if I reduce this down to -5, which is the level of the incoming signal, again, we're not going to see any movement on the needle. Okay, now if I move that down to -10, we're thinking, okay, now if our threshold's set at -10, and we know that our input signal is peaking at -5, that's going 5 decibels above the threshold, and therefore those 5 decibels that are exceeding our threshold should be compressed. Let's look at our compressor. Now our compressor isn't doing anything. Why is that then? The answer is the ratio. Because we have a ratio of 1 to 1, our compressor is going to do nothing irrelevant of where this threshold is set. So, in order to understand how to make this compressor work and do anything, we therefore need to understand the ratio control. Now, what do the ratios mean? It's a fairly simple mathematical equation, and once it's kind of logged in your mind, you'll remember it forever. A ratio of 1 to 1 means that for every 1 decibel that the threshold is exceeded by, the signal will be reduced to only exceeding by 1 decibel. Let's say that again. For every 1 decibel that the threshold is exceeded by, the amount that exceeds the threshold will be reduced to 1 decibel. So a ratio of 1 to 1 means that for every 1 decibel that goes above the threshold, it'll be reduced to a maximum of 1 decibel. So if it exceeds by 1 decibel, the maximum allowed above the threshold will be 1 decibel. If it exceeds by 2 decibels, the maximum allowed will be 2 decibels above the threshold, and so on. 3 will be 3, 4 will be 4. So a ratio of 1 to 1 means there is no compression because the amount that it allows is equal to the amount that exceeds the threshold. Okay, so if we go to a ratio of 2 to 1, therefore, it means that for every 2 decibels that exceed the threshold, only 1 decibel is going to be allowed. So it's in effect a 50% reduction. Okay, so if we go 2 decibels above, it's going to be compressed to only allow 1 decibel above the threshold. So if we went 3 decibels above, we're only going to allow 50% of that, so we can only exceed the threshold by 1.5 decibels. If we go 4 decibels above the threshold, we can only exceed it by 50% of that, so we can only therefore go 2 decibels above the threshold. Following so far? Let's go to another ratio. Let's increase a little bit more. So if we go to a ratio of 3 to 1 is going to mean that for every 3 decibels we go above the threshold, only 1 is going to be allowed. So that's in effect a 66% reduction. Let's pick another number, and one that's easy to compute. If we went 6 decibels above the threshold, we're going to reduce that by 66%, and therefore we're only going to allow it to exceed by 2 decibels. We had 6, we're going to reduce that by 66%, and therefore we're going to only allow 2 decibels above the threshold. And the higher our ratio is increased, the more aggressive the compression becomes. So if we go to a ratio of 4 to 1, that is therefore a 75% reduction. If we go to 5 to 1, that is therefore an 80% reduction. And if we went all the way up to, let's say, 10 to 1, that is therefore a 90% reduction. So you can see that it's the combination of the threshold and the ratio that dictate, firstly, what part of the signal is going to be compressed, and secondly, how much it's going to be compressed by. So the threshold says, what part of the sound do you want to compress? Do you want to compress just a little bit, or do you want to compress a lot of it? And the ratio says, now that you've decided which part of the signal you want to compress, how aggressively do you want to compress that part of the signal? Let's take a look at some examples. Now, let's start with a very gentle compression. Ratio is set to 2 to 1. Our threshold is at -10, meaning that our signal is going to exceed the threshold by 5 decibels. If our ratio is set to 2 to 1, that means that the maximum that we can exceed that threshold by is 2.5 decibels, because if we're exceeding by 5 decibels and compressing that by 50%, then the maximum we can go over is 2.5 decibels. Let's take a look at our needle now. Now, we're seeing that our needle is not moving by that 2.5 decibels. That's strange. What that tells us is that there are other functions in this compressor that affect how this compressor works. It's not just as simple as saying, well, I'm going above by 5 decibels and I'm at 2 to 1, so I'll get 2.5 dB of gain reduction. Compression isn't quite as simple as that, unfortunately. But the theory is exactly as we've just said, okay? So follow with me. Now, let's say that I want to achieve those 2.5 decibels of gain reduction. Okay, I'm just going to use my threshold here and reduce it until I'm starting to see the needle bounce at that 2.5 dB reduction mark that I'm after. So I've reduced the threshold until it's come further down that signal enough that it's giving me the gain reduction that I want. Most compressors, though, will have another sort of visual display built in that is very helpful for understanding how these functions work, and that's the graph function. So let's switch to that there. Now, the graph function, which is displayed over here, is going to show effectively when and how the compressor is going to work. So to illustrate, I'm going to set some very extreme settings. So I'm going to set the ratio at 20 to 1 with a hard knee. And all those settings do is give us this very crude knee. This point here is called the knee, in order to illustrate really clearly how compression works. Now you'll see that as I adjust the threshold, that's making this graph sort of longer or shorter. We've got 0 dB up the top here. So if we go all the way to 0 dB, then nothing's going to be compressed. As we reduce the threshold, the point at which the compressor is going to start working comes down and down and down. So if I play this, you'll see a little dot bouncing around on this line somewhere, and that's the input signal. So what we can do is to clearly see where the signal is, and therefore as we reduce the threshold, we can see the point at which the compressor is going to start working. So you see there, even though I'm getting no signal on my meter, the threshold is being exceeded. So this compressor is doing something. Let's try, it'll be difficult to hear, but let's try bypassing this. Definitely sounds different. So with compression, part of the challenge is that you need to be able to listen and trust your ears. You can't just go off what you're seeing visually. You have to listen, use your musical brain and say, am I hearing what I want to hear? It's really a crucial skill that you must develop with compression in particular. Now, let's bring this threshold down so that we're going to compress more of this signal. Okay, now I've got some quite aggressive compression. I'm going to back off this ratio so it's not compressing so aggressively, because at 20:1, we are compressing by a ratio of 95%. Okay, so with that setting as it is, you can see and hear that the compressor is acting on the kick and snare because they're louder, but the hi-hat in between isn't being touched. Let's hear that again. Now, the next really simple control to understand on a compressor is the makeup gain. So we can use makeup gain to level match our input and output signal. Now, our input signal was peaking at -5 dB. Our output signal at the moment is at -5.2. So I can put some of that back in. Now, in fact, this compressor, the fine tuning isn't great, so I can only go by half a dB increment. So for the sake of gain matching identically, I'm just going to do it on a gain control here. Now, I think in order to hear this a little bit better, we should compress this signal more aggressively. So let's pull down another 5 dB. Okay, so now we're compressing much more of the signal. So let's now gain match this. Okay, so let's A-B the two. So we're hearing more sustain on the snare drum, and we're hearing the hi-hats come through more clearly. Listen for those two things in particular. Cool, that's all well and good. But then what do these other three controls do on our compressor? Check back for part 2 and we'll go through those things.